Welcome to Exposure, where you will learn metering basics through to histogram, through to exposure modes like how to use program, shutter priority, aperture priority, and manual, what works best for me and when to use them. Then John will teach you portrait exposure setup in high key and low key situations. Exposure is all about controlling the amount of light that is coming into your camera. There are two things that stop a photograph from being usable. One is poor exposure and the other is poor focus. This segment is so important to learn the power of controlling that exposure.
Welcome to the exposure section. Now it's time to dial in the right shutter speeds, apertures, ISOs to make sure that we have the proper exposure. So let's start off talking about the light meter, because we have to measure the light, make sure that we get our cameras set properly. So we need to understand how our cameras read light. Now, what photographers really want to know is how much light is striking their subject, how much light is arriving at their subject. And if we know that, we're going to know how to set our camera. Back in the old days of photography, we used to carry around an incident light meter. And this is something that we could walk up to our subject, we'd press the little magic button on it, and it would give us the shutter speeds, apertures, and ISOs that would yield an absolute perfect exposure. And we still use these. Many photographers still use the light meter, and they'll go up to their model and they'll hold it right up next to their face and press the button and get a reading for what the light is. And in a controlled studio environment, it's a great, for sure way of doing things, but it doesn't always work really easy out in the field. And that is why cameras have what's known as a reflected light meter. And this captures the reflected light that reaches the camera, and it then measures the light. And it can tell if there's a lot of light or very little light reaching the camera. The problem is that we now have the original light source and our subject, which can be of various brightness levels, which can affect how much light actually reached the camera. And so we have to interpret this information because it's not the straight true information, because it's bouncing off of a subject. And camera light meters are based off of an 18% gray average. The average between light and dark is 18% gray, and this is what cameras think pretty much everything should be in brightness. All right, so when your subject is of a middle tone gray subject, you're going to get proper exposure on your subject and the background. Where things get a little bit tricky is when your subject is darker or lighter than average. When it's darker, less light comes to the camera, and the camera, it kind of freaks out. It doesn't know what to do. It's like, well, this is really dark. Well, let's change the settings on the camera and brighten this subject up by changing the shutter speeds or whatever settings on the camera. And what happens is your subject then becomes middle tone gray, as well as the background and everything else around it. And it kind of ruins the subject in many ways. So we have to be aware of subjects that are especially dark, and the same is true for subjects that are very light colored. In this case, more light than average comes back to the camera. The camera's meter freaks out, thinks there's too much light, recommends there's all sorts of changes to reduce the amount of light to make your subject darker, back down to that average of 18% gray, and your subject is darker and the background is darker as well. And I know you spend a lot of money on your cameras, and they're really good cameras and all, but the cameras do not instinctively know if your subjects are light, medium, or dark. That is something that you're going to have to decide, and you're going to have to make an adjustment when you are doing exposures if your subject is notably darker or lighter than average. So just keep that in the back of your mind, because we'll do some of those adjustments as we go through the rest of this class. Just be aware, any subject that's dark or light is going to need a little bit of exposure adjustment on your part to get it right. Now, when you look through the viewfinder of a traditional or average camera, you're going to often see what's called a graphic light meter. And it's this little indicator that tells you whether you are overexposed. This would be one stop overexposed. Or if we go to the other side, we might have two stops of underexposure. It tells you how your camera is reading the light. Does it think it's lighter than it should be or darker than it should be? In most cases, we want to start this off at the middle section at 0, right in the middle of this scale. Now, some cameras, rather than using a graphic light meter, they'll just use a number, a numeric light meter. where 0 is an even exposure. It might tell you you're 1 stop overexposed or perhaps 2 stops underexposed. And in general, once again, you want to have this set to 0. So that would be an even exposure. You may need to take a look at your camera. You may need to look at the instruction manual to see exactly where that number is in the viewfinder of your camera. But it's something that you should definitely be aware of and be consciously looking at regularly when you are setting your exposures up. The metering mode is how your camera reads the light coming in the camera. There are a variety of ways to do this, and there are adjustments that you can do in various situations to get a more correct reading of light. Traditionally, cameras used what is known as a center-weighted metering system, which means it measures the light in the middle of the frame, more importantly than light off to the edges of the frame, because that's usually where our subject is. And it's a system that worked well for many years, but photographers wanted to get more precise readings, and so they tried to make it as tight as they could, and they developed a spot meter. So a lot of cameras will have a spot meter that allows you to read the light in a very particular area. So if you wanted to be very precise about lighting of a small area in the frame, you could do that with the spot meter. And this is how many photographers worked for many, many years. And then came along something that I like to call multi-segment metering. It goes by different names by different manufacturers, but in general, it's a whole bunch of spot meters that is going through a very smart computer program to figure out the best average for all of them. It's looking at the light areas and the dark areas and doesn't want anything to get too bright or too dark, and you end up with a pretty good average in most all situations. And so this multi-segment meter works really well in most all situations. So once again, we have a center-weighted system, and I don't know that I would recommend that for the portrait photographer very often. It doesn't seem to be the right tool. Spot metering would be a good advanced mode to go into if you have very tricky lighting and you do not have a handheld light meter. You could get a skin tone and get a reading for that and get that set right in your camera. But for most people, a multi-segment metering, which goes by different names. For instance, Canon calls it evaluative, Nikon calls it matrix. So check your instruction manual to see what your camera company calls it, is going to be a great system because it's very versatile in a wide variety of situations. One of the great advantages of the digital platform on cameras is being able to check your image afterwards to see if you got the right exposure. But reading your image on the back of the camera isn't always so easy to tell if you got the right exposure. But if you know how to read the histogram, you can be sure whether you got the right exposure while you are out in the field. Now, after you've taken a photograph, you can play it back and you can see the image, and that may or may not give you some good information about whether it was properly exposed. The best way to tell is by pressing the information, the display button, or whatever button on your camera brings up that additional graph of information. Now, this is the histogram, and it's a graph of the tonal distribution. This tells you whether your picture is too bright or too dark or properly exposed. And what it's showing you is it's showing you pixels. And for the moment, let's forget about color and just think about tonality from light to dark. And what the histogram does is it organizes all of these pixels into columns with the darkest over on the left and the brightest over on the right, and those middle-toned ones right there in the middle. Now, an average photograph might be this big mound of gray pixels in the middle. If your picture is very bright, a very light subject, it's going to be kind of mounded up on the right-hand side. And if it's a very dark subject, it's going to be kind of mounded up against the left wall of the histogram. So if we look at the histogram, it's broken up into different parts, different tonalities, and it shows us if we have very much information in the dark areas, in the shadows, in the midtones, or in the highlights. Most of the time, we want to have a lot of information in the midtones because in post-production, after we've shot the photograph and we're working with it on the computer, we can adjust the brightness of it if it's in the middle. If it's way over on the extremes, for instance, this histogram I do like quite a bit because there is nothing in the pure blacks and there is nothing in the pure whites, which means I can take all those other pixels which have color information and I can make them a little bit lighter, I can make them a little bit darker. Anything that is recorded as pure black or pure white at the time that you took the photograph, you're going to have very little adjustment that you can do with it. There's very little. So you want to try to get as much information in the middle as possible. And so if we take our photograph and we change the exposure, you can see what the histogram looks like from an overexposed photograph and an underexposed photograph. And so this is just another tool for you to judge if you got the right exposure and whether you need to make a change with the shutter speed, the aperture, or the ISO. And so there are really three pieces of evidence that you can look at. One is the picture on the back of the camera. That's fine as a starting point. You can look at the histogram to see whether it's to the left or to the right, and is it too bright or too dark? And then you can look at your subject itself for what seems appropriate. And based on those three pieces of evidence, you should be able to look at your camera and the histogram and determine if you are getting a good exposure. Now, you do have a small leeway for making a mistake, and so you don't have to be 100% spot on, but in general, you want to be as close to the mark as you can get in this. And so take your camera out, take some photos, play them back, and look at the histogram and start learning what histograms look like for different subjects. In general, one of the things you want to watch out for, like this middle example, is overexposure is too much information to the right side of the frame. Having too much information blown out with no detail in it can be very, very hard on many photos. And so you generally want to avoid too many blown out pixels, as we call it, overexposed pixels that we will not be able to correct for later on. So check your images, check your histogram. If it looks good on the histogram, it's going to be a good photograph to work with. All right, next it's time to dive into the exposure modes, how our cameras are set up with our shutter speeds, apertures, and ISOs. So it's very common on a lot of cameras to have a mode dial on the top. Not all cameras have this, but most of them do it. And it allows you to set the camera up for different types of automation or manual control over the shutter speeds and the aperture. Some cameras will actually just feature a mode button with a dial that you would also have to turn. With these, there are going to be some options for manual or partial manual control, and we're going to go through these one by one. A lot of cameras will also have several automatic sections that will go through and automatically set up the camera for you. For instance, you put it in that green camera zone or the auto mode. It's going to control exposure, shutter speeds, apertures, ISO, focusing, and many, many other things. One of the problems that I don't like about this particular mode is that there are limitations on menus and various features that you have access to. Also, not being in control is not a very good thing in a creative endeavor like photography. You want to be able to have control over all those features that we've gone through in previous sections in this class. So let's start with the program option. This is available on pretty much all the cameras out there. And what the camera will do in this mode is it will select a shutter speed and an aperture according to the light levels. Now, the one aspect that it's not controlling that you will have set someplace else is the ISO. And so you set that up, and then if you put it in the program mode, then the camera will work shutter speeds and apertures to solve whatever problems you might have. Now, the program mode is nice for very simple and basic situations, but it's not the best for everything. Let's look at how it works. So when you put it in the program mode, what the camera's program is, what's programmed into it, is that it doesn't want you to have too slow a shutter speed, which is a good thing for most portrait photographs. That's fairly accurate. But what exact shutter speed do you want? Well, the camera's going to make its own decision for you. And so one of the things that you can do on most all cameras is something that is known as program shift. This allows you to turn one dial and the camera will change the entire program, both shutter speeds and apertures, simultaneously in order to keep the same exposure but with different factors. So you can adjust it to a faster shutter speed with a wider open aperture. You can change it to a longer shutter speed with more depth of field. And so you can adjust it wherever you need to or wherever you want to in there. Most of the time, it'll want to be set in some sort of middle place. Something to warn you about, though, is that some cameras reset and some cameras do not. Meaning that if you were to set the camera to a faster shutter speed and shoot a bunch of pictures and then kind of put the camera down for a minute and then pick it back up again, some cameras will reset back down to the basic settings, so you would have to reset it back to the faster shutter speeds. Or in some cases, they'll stay there So if you were to go do a different type of photography, they're still in their old type of system. So it's not something that I recommend for most portrait type photography because you're not keeping really specific control over the shutter speeds and apertures. It can be good for quick shots, but when you have a little bit of time and you really want to get things right, this is probably not the best mode. Next up is the shutter priority mode. Some cameras will call this the time value mode, but it's the same thing either way around. And that is you get to control the shutter speed. The camera will figure out the aperture in order to give you a proper exposure. So in this case, obviously you get to choose a shutter speed, which is a very important consideration for a portrait photographer, but so is the aperture. In this case, the camera is going to take care of the aperture. So if you choose a shutter speed of a 60th of a second, it'll figure out with the light what aperture is most appropriate for that. Now, if you choose a really fast shutter speed, there may not be enough light. If you go up and choose 2,000th of a second and you don't have a lot of light or you don't have a very fast lens, well, your camera is going to allow you to take a photo at that very fast shutter speed and an aperture that's not quite right. What's probably going to happen when you hold the camera up at that very fast shutter speed, you're going to get a blinking warning somewhere in the viewfinder letting you know that you do not have enough light or you do not have enough of a wide aperture on your lens for that particular scenario. And it's a very small, subtle warning that you're going to take a bad photo, but you do need to be aware of that. So you might want to take a look at that on your camera. Now, this can also happen on the extreme low end if you were choosing very low shutter speeds, but that's usually not an issue shooting portraits in here. And so the shutter speed mode is not one that I would highly recommend, and that's because the variances of light and so forth means that your camera can very easily choose the wrong aperture or not have an aperture at all to choose. And so there's a lot of very unusable settings in the shutter priority mode. And so one minor exception for those of you that are a little bit more advanced is that you could use a shutter priority mode with auto ISO. That way, if your camera doesn't have an appropriate aperture, the ISO would kick in and make adjustments for you. And so it's not that you never should use this mode, you just need to use it with some precautions. The next mode is the aperture priority mode. This is a mode that a lot of photographers like because they will choose the aperture and the camera will figure out the shutter speed. And so the advantage here is that there are a lot more shutter speeds to match up with those apertures. And so if you wanted to choose an aperture in the middle of the range, you're going to get a moderate shutter speed under normal lighting conditions. If you want to open up your aperture to a very wide setting like 1.4 to 2.8, what that's going to mean is that you're going to get very shallow depth of field, or you will also have a faster shutter speed to freeze motion, which is very good for a lot of portrait work. On the other end of the spectrum, if you were to close down the aperture quite far, you're going to get a very slow shutter speed, and you're going to get that maximizing depth of field point of view, as well as getting slow shutter speeds to blur motion if you want to do that. And that's not very much in the world of portrait photography. And then in the middle, the happy middle you might say, we have f4 to f8 in general for most lenses, and this is where you're going to get the maximum sharpness for a lens. This would be a great place shooting in the studio, where you have enough light, you want to have your subject really sharp as possible, and you have maybe more control of the background. When you're shooting out in the field, you have less control over what the background is, and you want it a little bit blurrier. You could set this to the wider settings like 1.4 to 2.8. And so this isn't a terrible mode for shooting portraits. It's okay. It's not as good as manual in my mind because things can change back and forth. And if you move from one side to the other, the background becomes different. It's a different amount of light coming in the camera, and the camera can start changing exposure on you. And so in general, it's pretty good, but it's not perfect. Now, the modes that we've been talking about so far are program, shutter priority, and aperture priority have something in common. These are all auto exposure modes, which means that the camera is automatically controlling the brightness of your image according to what it thinks is a normal brightness image. And so this is where it's keeping the exposure indicator directly in the middle of the frame. And that's not where it should always be. So we need to talk about a little different area of photography, and this is exposure compensation. All cameras have this, and it's the ability to shoot a brighter or darker subject should you want to. Now, you'll often see either a plus minus button or perhaps even a dial on some cameras that have more retro controls, and this allows you to lighten or darken the photograph in any situation. Now, there are many situations that you might photograph that are lighter than average or darker than average. And in this particular photograph, we have a subject in a white dress with a very light colored background. This picture should be much, much brighter than it is. The camera does not understand that this subject is very light. Between the background and the dress, it's a very, very light subject. So we need to adjust the exposure in this case about 2 stops brighter. So now we're actually getting proper skin tones for our model, and the dress and the background are the appropriate brightness in this case. And so with our cameras in the aperture priority, shutter priority, and the program mode, that's when you would be using this exposure compensation. Now, if the background is primarily dark, there's a very dark dress, it's a very dark scene in an overall sense, a camera at standard exposure is going to overexpose this. The skin tones are too light in this case. And so what we need to do is we need to dial down the exposure and make it darker in this case to reflect the way it looks in reality. And so a -2 exposure is where this image looks better. And so be aware of situations that are much darker and much lighter than average, because with those situations and any of the automated modes, that is when you can go in and use some exposure compensation. And so it's a good way to fix up a problem very quickly. All right, the next mode, and the mode that you should become very comfortable using, is the full manual mode. This means that you're setting shutter speeds, apertures, and ISOs as you want. This manual mode here on the mode dial is mainly concerning the shutter speed and the aperture. ISO is still a separate setting that you're going to make in a different location. But with the camera in manual here, you'll be using the controls on the camera for selecting shutter speeds and apertures. In this case, you'll be working also with the light meter. And the first thing that you should do is decide what's most important in your photograph. Is it your shutter speeds or your apertures, and make that adjustment. Let's go ahead and make that adjustment with the aperture and set it at 5.6. Kind of a middle of the road, very sharp setting. Then what we're going to do is we're going to change our shutter speed, but we're going to keep an eye on our exposure meter, and we're going to wait. We're going to turn our shutter speeds, and we're going to keep turning them until the exposure indicator gets to the middle or to the 0 setting. And that means we have a proper exposure. It's not too bright, it's not too dark. That's a great place to take our first test photo and check it out on the back of the camera, look at the image, look at the histogram, and decide whether that really is the correct exposure. Do you need to let in a little more light or a little less light? And this way, once you have it set up in manual exposure, every picture is going to be exactly the same in its brightness. And that's generally what you want. If you're going to take a series of photos, you're trying to get the best expression, you're trying to get the best poses, the best composition. You don't want the brightness levels going up and down between every single photograph. And so manual exposure will keep things consistent for you. And this is a great reason why many photographers, most photographers doing portrait photography, will use manual exposure, because you usually have a little bit of time to do a test shot, dial in the right settings, and then be consistent for that particular setup that you are shooting. If you were to change the background between your subject stays the same lighting, but you decided to change the background, it would throw off the light meter, because the background is going to affect the way the light meter reads the light. And so if we were to look at the light meter reading from these 3 different scenarios, one's going to look darker, one's going to look normal, and one's going to look brighter, and it all has to do with how bright the background is. And you may need to make that adjustment when you are manually shooting. If you were to instead use one of the automated modes for doing this type of work with same subject, different backgrounds, this is how it would look, and this is what the meter would look like. The meter would think it got everything right. It's put everything in the middle, but the dark background fooled it or the light background fooled it, and now the skin tones don't look right. And so manual exposure with a couple of test shots will get you right where you want to be and get you consistent results. And so when you put in all the time to get the right place in an exposure, you want it to be consistent as you go throughout all of your shots. Now let's talk about what are the exact numbers that we would set in any particular scenario. So let's run through a standard portrait. And so in this case, The background doesn't matter too much because we've already got a nice clean background. Maybe we're working in the studio or just we have a nice clean wall as a background. So we're not trying to do the super shallow depth of field. We just want our subject looking nice and sharp. So let's get our camera set up with all the important controls here. So the first thing that's kind of a given in this is that it would be best if you could be shooting at a low ISO, like 100. If you need to bump it up, you can, but this is a good place to start off. You want to start off in the right place. The next thing that we want to do is we want to think about our shutter speed. Because in this case, we're hand-holding the camera, our subject is standing there, we want to make sure they're sharp. And so a good, safe shutter speed for most portraits is going to be 125. This is a really good starting point for the shutter speeds. Now with the apertures, in this particular case, we're not trying to go with really shallow depth of field. We want something in the middle of the range to give us some very good sharpness. So let's just say we chose 5.6. Well, this is kind of where we have our dream settings. This is what we would like to be able to do. Now let's take a look at the light meter and see where our cameras are actually at. All right, we got some problems here, folks. The camera is blinking a red light at us that says that we are more than 3 stops underexposed. So we're going to have to lighten up this subject by quite a bit. What can we do to lighten up this subject? Well, I could go to a lower shutter speed, but then I would get blur and that would ruin the photograph, so that doesn't make sense. I could go down to a wider aperture and that wouldn't have too much effect, but cameras can handle a little bit higher ISO very easy, and so in this case, I don't mind going up a little bit with the ISO to 800. Now, if I do that, I went up to 800 and I didn't go any further because most cameras will shoot very, very clean up to 800. We are still 1 stop darker than where we want to be, and so we're going to need to let in some more light. I've kind of told you I don't want to go any further with the ISO. I don't want to go any further with the shutter speed, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to come down with the aperture and let in a bit more light and put it at f4. And this is the balance and compromise in this particular lighting situation. If I had ultimate control, I would turn on brighter lights, but this is naturally lit. I would have more light coming in, and that way I could be down at ISO 100 and back up at 5.6. But I had to make some accommodations for lower light levels, which is a very common scenario in photography. I've got an even exposure. I take a look at the back of the camera, I look at the histogram, it looks good. I can continue shooting on and getting very consistent results with good settings for this shot. Another type of portrait that you might want to take is a shallow depth of field shot. This is where you have part of your subject or your subject in focus and other parts of the image out of focus. In this case, we're focusing on the eye of our subject, and what we want is the eye to be in focus, and we want it to go as out of focus in the other areas of the image as much as possible. So let's take a look at how we would do this sort of setup. In this case, we're going to start off again at ISO 100. We're always hoping for the best. We'll start there, and we'll adjust as necessary if we need to. In this case, we're trying to get shallow depth of field, so our aperture is probably going to be our first setting. In this case, we have a lens that goes all the way down to 1.2, and that's what we're going to take advantage of because our primary goal in this setup is shallow depth of field. The next thing we're going to do is choose our shutter speed. And as I've said many times before, 125th of a second is a good shutter speed to go to. It's a nice place to be for portraits. You generally don't want to be lower than that. If you can go higher, that's fine too, but 125 is a good trade-off. Let's take a look at the light meter. Light meter says, ooh, okay, we are 1 stop overexposed. Now this is kind of a good problem. We have too much light coming in and we need to control it. Now we can't do anything with the ISO. We can't take it down any lower in this case. And if we need to make it darker, we could do it with the aperture by closing it down to around f2 or so, but that defeats the purpose that we were trying to do in this particular photograph, which was shallow depth of field. And we could do it with shutter speed by going up to a faster shutter speed, and there's no downside to going to a faster shutter speed in this case. So definitely going up to 2/50th of a second solves the problem of this particular scenario. And so that's the priorities and how you would go through these one step at a time. Now you might say, but you spent so much time going through this, and in the real world, it happens very, very quickly. Well, this is something that you have a little bit of time and learning on, and you'll get better at it and gets quicker and quicker as you go along. And it's something you really only need to do for the first shot, because once you have the first shot dialed in, unless there's major changes in the lighting, you can keep the same setup for the whole rest of the series of photos in this location at this time. And that's the beauty of working in manual exposure, is you get to have control over shutter speeds and aperture. Another important concept to think about is high key, low key. This is to say either a bright image or a dark image. Not all images end up being this middle tone gray of average brightness. Some of them are much brighter and some of them are much darker while you are manually exposing. So you need to make an adjustment for those. So, being aware of this, your camera can overexpose or underexpose. And a way to do a test series is an exposure bracket series. And this is where the camera will shoot a series of photos, darker, normal, and lighter, so that you can see what it's going to look like. Traditionally, this was always done with 3 exposures. That always seemed to be enough and reasonable. Modern cameras will have many more options. They'll give you the option of doing 5 or 7 exposures, so you can see the exposure latitude of your subject. And this is not something I recommend shooting your portraits with, intending to get a good portrait shot. This is just to get a test sample of what is the correct exposure in a particular case. And so you're overexposing and underexposing to see what is the best average place for you to be. So with a camera pointed at a subject that has a light background, and in this case a white dress, the camera wants to give you an average exposure. And if we look at the histogram at the bottom of the screen, just looking at the histogram, if you look at nothing else, I would say, yeah, that looks like a perfectly good histogram. You've got yourself a good exposure. But looking at the photograph and the content in the photograph, I realized that this photo is far too dark. And rather than putting that indicator right below the 0, that indicator should be farther off to the right. This is a picture that you need to overexpose or expose so that it is brighter. This is predominantly a light scene, and so we need to have the histogram reflect that. And so on the right side of your screen is our high key photograph. That's 2 stops overexposed. But if we look at the histogram makes sense with what's in the photograph. And so one of the most important lessons I learned as I went through photography is that that little indicator doesn't always need to be below the 0. Sometimes it's below it, sometimes it's above it. This is a good case as to why you would not want to put it right below the 0. The same is true on the reverse. When you have a darker background, a dark dress in this case, the camera is going to try to lighten everything up, and the skin tones are not correct in this photograph. We need to underexpose for this low-key image. And if we look at the photograph and we look at the histogram, they make sense. Yes, this is a dark image, and we're supposed to have dark information in the histogram, and that little indicator telling you where the exposure is going to be in the -1, maybe -2. It doesn't go beyond -2 in most normal situations, but it needed to go there for this particular one. So be aware of those very high key and low key situations, because some of those are the best and most exciting types of portraits that are very edgy in their look. And they need to be adjusted when you are shooting those to get those to look right. Another example of a low-key image has a lot of dark area. Another example of a high-key image. It's going to matter the skin tones of your subject, the clothing that they're wearing, and the background. All of those, everything in the frame is going to impact how bright and dark that image is. And not everything is right in the middle.
I'm going to take the Canon 5D Mark IV and put it through its ISO paces. I have never been afraid of having noise or grain that you get from higher ISO on my portraiture, because I come from a film background, and film always had so much grain and yumminess, so I've always loved to push my ISOs on my digital sensor. I want to show you how remarkable the Mark IV is. I've done many tests on different levels of digital SLRs, And the smaller digital SLRs all even out around 2000 ISO, which is very low light. And then the bigger digital SLRs, like the Canon Mark IV, can go right up into the tens of thousands. So I'm going to bracket and photograph a 100 ISO, 400 ISO, 800, 1600, 3200 and 6400, so that we can then zoom in to the finished image and see exactly how much grain and noise is in there and how far we can push our own cameras. I want you to do this test with your camera and see where your ISO is at perfection. 100 ISO, natural light. Just your chin this way, beautiful. Chin down a tiny touch. Gotcha, love that. Chin this way, tiny tickle more. Beautiful. Now what I'm going to do is take my ISO up to 400. Now I'm also going to alter my aperture and my shutter speed because I am bracketing based on natural light behind me. I'm at 1/25th of a second in my shutter speed and an aperture of 2.8. I am now at an ISO of 400. Just a little smile in those eyes. Beautiful, good girl. Absolutely gorgeous. Now I'm going to take my ISO up to 800. And I will have to adjust my shutter speed for a perfect exposure. I am now at a shutter speed of 1/200th of a second, an aperture of 3.2, and I am at 800 ISO. The meter in my camera is reading perfect exposure. Now I'm going to increase my ISO even further, this time to 1600. I am going to bring up my aperture to 4.0. Let's check the light and look at our shutter speed, and I'm going to speed up my shutter to 1/250th of a second. So effectively, to create the same amount of light coming into the camera, I am upping my ISO to allow more light to come in, and to even it out, I am increasing my shutter speed to make the shutter faster because the ISO is letting more light in, and I'm telling the shutter how long to stay open. We'll have consistent light in all images, but a totally different way of looking at the grain, noise, and ISO in each image. It also tells you how far you can shoot in low light situations with the camera you have, and you know you can push it to this ISO before you have to get an off-camera flash or more light. Beautiful. I am now going to go up to an ISO of 3200. I am also going to take my aperture to 5.6. I'm going to do a little light test. I am getting a perfect reading at 5.6 at 3200 ISO. Oh, beautiful. As you can see, this camera is performing extraordinarily well at 3200 ISO. So here I am, 3200. I'm going to speed up my shutter to 320. I am at an aperture of 5.6 at 3200 ISO. Chin down just a tiny touch, a little baby this way, a little tiny touch. There it is, tiny little smile in your eyes. Beautiful, good girl. And as you can see, this camera is performing beautifully at 3200 ISO. I'm now going to take it to 6400. Woohoo, let's see, let's push this up. I'm at an aperture of 8. I went from 5.6 to let's 7.1. Let's try 7.1. I'm still at a shutter speed of 320. So let me just take a test. I like this. I could definitely take my shutter up one more click. I'm going to take it to 400. So I have a shutter of 400, an aperture of 7.1, and an ISO of 6400. Beautiful. Now let's have a look in there and see how this camera performs at 6400. Baby smile, just a tickle. Gotcha. So as you can see, you're going to test in increments the increase in ISO to get a consistency in your photographs. Just keep adjusting your shutter speed faster as you open up your light to get consistency, and then you can truly see how that ISO performs in low light. You now know that when you're inside with window light or in a low light situation or in the evening or at an event, how far you can open up that shutter and push that ISO with nice open apertures to get really gorgeous depth of field and a little bit of grain and noise in your images. So have fun testing and see what your camera can do.